In the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory, where the wind carries secrets across endless horizons and the sun beats down mercilessly on weathered faces, a peculiar encounter was about to unfold that would challenge everything Samuel Harrison thought he knew about life, love, and the supernatural mysteries of the frontier. The year was 1887, and the small town of Deadwood Gulch had seen its share of strange occurrences, but nothing quite like what was approaching on that fateful Tuesday morning when the ground trembled beneath the hooves of an impossibly large horse carrying an even more impossible rider. Samuel had been tending to his cattle on the outskirts of his modest ranch when he first spotted the towering figure on the horizon. At nearly 7 feet tall, the woman sat astride a massive Clydesdale that seemed dwarfed by her commanding presence. Her black dress billowed in the wind like storm clouds gathering for a tempest, and her pale skin seemed to glow with an otherworldly luminescence that made Samuel question whether the desert heat was playing tricks on his weathered eyes. As she drew closer, he could make out her striking features, angular and sharp as carved marble, with eyes the color of winter storms and hair as dark as a moonless night. The woman dismounted with fluid grace that seemed to defy her considerable height, her boots making deep impressions in the dusty earth as she approached Samuel's fence line. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried an accent he couldn't quite place, something European perhaps, with vowels that seemed to stretch like taffy and consonants that cut through the air like a blade through silk. She introduced herself simply as Magdalena Volkov, recently widowed and seeking a new beginning in the American frontier, though something in her eyes suggested she was running from far more than just memories of a deceased husband. Samuel had always considered himself a practical man, shaped by years of drought, cattle rustling, and the endless struggle to carve out a living from unforgiving land. At 42, he had resigned himself to bachelorhood after a string of failed courtships with the handful of eligible women in Deadwood Gulch. His weathered hands and sun-creased face told the story of a man who had learned to expect disappointment. Yet there was something about this mysterious widow that stirred feelings he thought had died along with his youthful optimism. As Magdalena spoke, her words seemed to carry weight beyond their literal meaning, as if each syllable contained secrets that Samuel's rational mind couldn't quite grasp. She spoke of her late husband, a man of considerable stature who had died under mysterious circumstances in the mountains of Colorado, leaving her with resources but no family ties to anchor her to any particular place. Her hands, he noticed, were unusually large and strong for a woman, with fingers that seemed capable of crushing stone. Yet they moved with surprising delicacy as she gestured to emphasize her words. The first hook came when Magdalena fixed Samuel with her penetrating gaze and spoke the words that would haunt his dreams for weeks to come. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, yet somehow carried clearly across the distance between them, cutting through the constant prairie wind like a knife through butter. She told him that she had traveled across 3 territories searching for a specific type of man, someone with particular qualities that she needed for a purpose she could not yet fully explain. Samuel felt his heart racing as she described these qualities, each one matching his own characteristics with unsettling precision, from his height and build to more obscure details about his family lineage that she should have had no way of knowing. The conversation took an even stranger turn when Magdalena began speaking about children, her eyes taking on a distant quality, as if she were seeing something far beyond the dusty landscape surrounding them. She spoke of her desperate desire for a child, but not just any child. Her words became increasingly cryptic as she described visions she claimed to have experienced, dreams of an offspring who would possess abilities far beyond those of ordinary humans. Samuel found himself simultaneously fascinated and terrified by her intensity. The way her voice seemed to vibrate with barely contained power when she spoke of her future progeny. As the weeks passed, Magdalena became a regular presence around Deadwood Gulch, though she seemed to materialize and disappear with no clear pattern or explanation for her movements. The townspeople whispered about her unusual height and the strange occurrences that seemed to follow in her wake. Livestock would be found arranged in peculiar patterns in fields where she had been seen walking, and several residents reported dreams of impossible geometric shapes and sounds that seemed to come from deep underground. The local preacher, Reverend Matthews, became increasingly agitated whenever Magdalena's name was mentioned, claiming that her presence brought an unwholesome influence to their Christian community. Samuel found himself drawn into increasingly lengthy conversations with the mysterious widow, discussions that ranged from practical matters of frontier life to philosophical questions about the nature of existence and humanity's place in the grand scheme of creation. Magdalena possessed knowledge that seemed far beyond what any frontier woman should have acquired, speaking with authority about subjects ranging from advanced mathematics to ancient European folklore. She would reference obscure historical events with the casual familiarity of someone who had witnessed them firsthand, though Samuel calculated that she could not be more than 35 years old at most. The second hook arrived on a moonless night in late October when Magdalena appeared at Samuel's ranch house without warning. Her usually composed demeanor replaced by an urgency that set every nerve in his body on edge. She paced his small living room like a caged predator, her movements creating shadows that seemed to move independently of her form in the flickering lamplight. Her words tumbled out in a rush as she explained that time was running short, that certain celestial alignments were approaching that would not occur again for several decades. She needed his answer, she insisted, regarding a proposition she had not yet fully articulated but which Samuel somehow understood on an instinctual level that would change everything about his quiet bachelor existence. That night, Magdalena revealed the true nature of her quest and the reason she had sought him out specifically. She spoke of bloodlines and genetic inheritance, of traits that had been carefully preserved through generations of selective breeding in the remote valleys of Eastern Europe. Her late husband, she explained, had been chosen for similar reasons, but their union had been cut short by circumstances she described only as interference from those who fear progress. Samuel listened in growing amazement as she outlined a plan that sounded like something from a fever dream, involving the creation of a child who would possess physical and mental capabilities far exceeding normal human limitations. The mystery deepened when Magdalena produced a leather satchel filled with documents that seemed to chronicle her family's history going back several centuries. The papers were covered in cramped handwriting in multiple languages, accompanied by detailed genealogical charts and what appeared to be scientific observations about inherited traits and their manifestation across generations. Samuel's limited education made it difficult for him to fully comprehend the technical aspects of what she was showing him, but the implications were clear enough to make his hands tremble as he held the fragile pages. As winter approached, strange events began occurring around Samuel's ranch with increasing frequency. His cattle would be found grouped in perfect circles, standing motionless as if in some kind of trance, their eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed distinctly unbovine. The local wildlife began behaving erratically, with predators and prey species observed coexisting peacefully in areas where Magdalena had been seen walking. Most disturbing of all, Samuel began experiencing vivid dreams of a child with his features but Magdalena's unsettling eyes. A child who seemed to possess knowledge and abilities that filled Dream Samuel with equal measures of pride and terror. The townspeople of Deadwood Gulch grew increasingly suspicious of the relationship developing between Samuel and the mysterious widow. Rumors spread like wildfire through the small community, with speculation ranging from the merely scandalous to the genuinely supernatural. Some claimed to have seen Magdalena communicating with wild animals in what sounded like human language, while others swore they had witnessed her lifting objects that should have required the strength of several men. The town doctor, a rational man named Ezra Whitman, became particularly interested in Magdalena after treating several residents for what he described as nervous exhaustion following encounters with the tall widow. The first major revelation came when Samuel discovered that Magdalena had been less than truthful about certain aspects of her background. While investigating her claims about her late husband's death in Colorado, he learned from a traveling merchant that no one matching her description had been seen in that territory for over a decade. Further inquiries revealed inconsistencies in her story about where she had lived and when various events in her life had supposedly occurred. When Samuel confronted her with these discrepancies, Magdalena's reaction was not the defensive anger he had expected, but rather a sad resignation, as if she had been waiting for this moment of discovery. The truth, when Magdalena finally revealed it, was far stranger than any of the theories Samuel had constructed to explain the inconsistencies in her story. She was indeed a widow, but her husband had died not in Colorado but in a remote region of the Carpathian Mountains nearly 50 years earlier. Her true age, she confessed, was considerably greater than her appearance suggested, though she claimed not to know the exact number of years she had existed. The preservation of her youth and vitality was connected to the same bloodline she hoped to continue through Samuel, part of an inheritance that carried both extraordinary gifts and terrible burdens. Samuel's rational mind reeled as Magdalena described her true nature and the purpose that had driven her to seek him out across thousands of miles of wilderness. She spoke of a genetic legacy that stretched back to the earliest days of European civilization, a lineage that had been carefully maintained by a secretive group of families who understood the importance of preserving certain traits for future generations. Her search for a suitable partner was not motivated by romantic love or even simple desire for companionship, but by a biological imperative that she described as being as irresistible as the changing of seasons or the movement of tides. The revelation transformed Samuel's understanding of everything that had transpired between them over the past months. Her knowledge of his family history became explicable when she revealed that his own lineage had been tracked and documented by her people for generations, identified as carrying complementary genetic markers that would enhance rather than dilute the traits she sought to preserve. The strange dreams and supernatural occurrences around his ranch were side effects of her presence, manifestations of abilities that she kept carefully controlled but could not entirely suppress. As winter deepened and the isolation of the frontier became more pronounced, Samuel found himself grappling with a decision that would determine not only his own fate but potentially the future of human development itself. Magdalena painted a picture of their potential offspring as beings who would possess the physical capabilities to survive and thrive in environments that would kill ordinary humans, combined with intellectual abilities that would allow them to solve problems that had plagued humanity for millennia. She spoke of a future where their descendants would serve as bridges between humanity as it currently existed and what it might become given proper guidance and genetic optimization. The town of Deadwood Gulch became the stage for increasingly dramatic confrontations as word of Samuel's relationship with Magdalena spread beyond the local community. A group of traveling missionaries arrived claiming to have followed reports of supernatural activity, armed with religious texts and blessed silver implements they believed would be necessary to combat whatever evil had taken root in their remote corner of the territory. Their leader, a gaunt man named Silas Blackwood, spoke with the fevered intensity of a true believer as he warned the townspeople about the dangers of allowing Magdalena to continue her unholy work among God-fearing Christians. The conflict escalated when several townspeople reported seeing Magdalena engaged in what they described as ritual behavior during the dark hours before dawn. They claimed she would stand motionless in the center of Samuel's property for hours at a time, her arms raised toward the sky while she spoke in a language none of them recognized. The sounds she made, according to these witnesses, caused physical discomfort to anyone who heard them, producing headaches and nausea that lasted for days afterward. These reports only fueled Silas Blackwood's conviction that Magdalena represented a supernatural threat that needed to be eliminated before she could complete whatever dark purpose had brought her to their community. The turning point came when young Timothy Fletcher, the sheriff's teenage son, claimed to have witnessed Magdalena transforming before his eyes during one of her pre-dawn rituals. According to his breathless account, he had observed her body stretching and changing shape, growing even taller than her already impressive height while her limbs elongated in ways that defied human anatomy. Most disturbing of all, he insisted that during this transformation, multiple sets of eyes had opened along her arms and back, all of them focusing on him with an intelligence that froze him with terror until the ritual concluded and she returned to her normal appearance. Samuel found himself caught between his growing feelings for Magdalena and the mounting pressure from his community to break off their relationship. The woman he had come to care for was revealed to be something far more complex and potentially dangerous than he had ever imagined. Yet her honesty about her true nature had only deepened his respect for her courage in sharing such vulnerable information. He began to understand that her quest for a suitable partner was not merely personal, but represented the continuation of something ancient and important, a legacy that had survived centuries of persecution and misunderstanding. The mystery deepened further when Samuel discovered evidence that Magdalena's people had been present in the American frontier far longer than she had initially suggested. Hidden in the abandoned mine shafts around Deadwood Gulch, he found carved symbols that matched illustrations in the documents she had shown him, along with what appeared to be the remains of structures built according to architectural principles that seemed both ancient and impossibly advanced. The implications suggested that her search for him was part of a larger pattern of contact between her kind and certain human bloodlines, a process that had been ongoing for generations across multiple continents. As the confrontation with Silas Blackwood and his followers approached its climax, Magdalena revealed the final truth about her mission and the choice that Samuel would need to make. The child she sought to create would indeed possess abilities beyond normal human parameters, but these gifts would come at a cost that she had not previously disclosed. The offspring of their union would be compelled by the same biological imperatives that drove her, destined to continue the cycle of seeking and selecting suitable partners to further refine and enhance the genetic legacy they carried. Samuel would not simply be becoming a father, but participating in a process that would ultimately transform humanity itself over the course of many generations. The final revelation came when Magdalena admitted that her late husband had not died from natural causes or accident, but had been killed by members of his own community when they discovered the truth about what their union had produced. Their child, she revealed with tears streaming down her pale cheeks, had displayed such extraordinary abilities from birth that the local population had become convinced it represented a threat to the natural order. The mob that had formed to eliminate this perceived danger had succeeded in destroying both the child and its father, leaving Magdalena to flee with only her life and the determination to try again elsewhere with a more suitable partner. The weight of Magdalena's final revelation settled over Samuel like a suffocating blanket as he processed the true cost of what she was asking him to undertake. The image of her previous husband's violent death and the murder of their extraordinary child haunted his thoughts as he wandered the windswept plains surrounding his ranch, struggling to reconcile his growing love for this mysterious woman with the terrifying implications of their potential union. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about the dangers of involving himself in something so far beyond normal human experience, while another part of him felt an inexplicable pull toward a destiny that seemed to have been written in his very blood. As news of Timothy Fletcher's alleged sighting spread through Deadwood Gulch like wildfire, the tension in the small community reached a breaking point that threatened to explode into violence at any moment. Silas Blackwood had succeeded in convincing nearly half the townspeople that Magdalena represented an existential threat to their way of life, while the other half remained skeptical of the increasingly outlandish claims being made about the tall widow's supernatural nature. Samuel found himself ostracized by neighbors who had known him his entire adult life, treated with suspicion and fear as if his association with Magdalena had somehow contaminated him with whatever evil they believed she embodied. The confrontation that everyone had been dreading finally erupted on a bitter December evening when Blackwood led a torch-bearing mob to Samuel's ranch with the stated intention of driving Magdalena away from their community by force if necessary. Samuel stood on his front porch with his rifle in hand, watching the angry faces illuminated by flickering flames as they demanded he surrender the woman they had convinced themselves was some form of supernatural predator. Magdalena emerged from the house behind him, her towering frame casting an impossibly long shadow in the torchlight as she faced down the crowd with a composure that seemed almost supernatural in its complete lack of fear or concern. What happened next would be debated by the survivors for the rest of their lives, though none of them would ever speak of it openly outside their most trusted confidants. Magdalena stepped forward and began to speak in the strange language several witnesses had heard during her pre-dawn rituals, her voice carrying across the night air with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of everyone present. As she spoke, the temperature began to drop precipitously, far beyond what could be explained by normal winter weather patterns, and the flames of their torches began to flicker and dance in ways that defied the direction of the wind. Several members of the mob later claimed that as Magdalena's ritual words continued, they began to see impossible things in the shifting shadows around Samuel's ranch. Shapes moved at the periphery of their vision that seemed too large and wrong to be any normal animal, while sounds echoed from the darkness that resembled no creature they had ever heard in decades of frontier living. Most disturbing of all, they reported that the ground itself seemed to pulse beneath their feet, as if something enormous was stirring in the depths of the earth, responding to the call of the mysterious widow's otherworldly incantations. Silas Blackwood, either braver or more foolish than his followers, stepped forward with a silver crucifix raised high and began shouting biblical verses at the top of his lungs in an attempt to counter whatever power Magdalena was invoking. The confrontation between ancient ritual and Christian prayer created a crackling tension in the air that made everyone's hair stand on end, while strange lights began to dance in the sky above them despite the absence of clouds or aurora conditions. Samuel watched in fascination and terror as the two opposing forces seemed to battle for dominance over the very fabric of reality itself. The weight of Magdalena's final revelation settled over Samuel like a suffocating blanket as he processed the true cost of what she was asking him to undertake. The image of her previous husband's violent death and the murder of their extraordinary child haunted his thoughts as he wandered the windswept plains surrounding his ranch, struggling to reconcile his growing love for this mysterious woman with the terrifying implications of their potential union. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about the dangers of involving himself in something so far beyond normal human experience, while another part of him felt an inexplicable pull toward a destiny that seemed to have been written in his very blood. As news of Timothy Fletcher's alleged sighting spread through Deadwood Gulch like wildfire, the tension in the small community reached a breaking point that threatened to explode into violence at any moment. Silas Blackwood had succeeded in convincing nearly half the townspeople that Magdalena represented an existential threat to their way of life, while the other half remained skeptical of the increasingly outlandish claims being made about the tall widow's supernatural nature. Samuel found himself ostracized by neighbors who had known him his entire adult life, treated with suspicion and fear as if his association with Magdalena had somehow contaminated him with whatever evil they believed she embodied. The confrontation that everyone had been dreading finally erupted on a bitter December evening, when Blackwood led a torch-bearing mob to Samuel's ranch with the stated intention of driving Magdalena away from their community by force if necessary. Samuel stood on his front porch with his rifle in hand, watching the angry faces illuminated by flickering flames as they demanded he surrender the woman they had convinced themselves was some form of supernatural predator. Magdalena emerged from the house behind him, her towering frame casting an impossibly long shadow in the torchlight as she faced down the crowd with a composure that seemed almost supernatural in its complete lack of fear or concern. What happened next would be debated by the survivors for the rest of their lives, though none of them would ever speak of it openly outside their most trusted confidants. Magdalena stepped forward and began to speak in the strange language several witnesses had heard during her pre-dawn rituals, her voice carrying across the night air with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of everyone present. As she spoke, the temperature began to drop precipitously, far beyond what could be explained by normal winter weather patterns, and the flames of their torches began to flicker and dance in ways that defied the direction of the wind. Several members of the mob later claimed that as Magdalena's ritual words continued, they began to see impossible things in the shifting shadows around Samuel's ranch. Shapes moved at the periphery of their vision that seemed too large and wrong to be any normal animal, while sounds echoed from the darkness that resembled no creature they had ever heard in decades of frontier living. Most disturbing of all, they reported that the ground itself seemed to pulse beneath their feet, as if something enormous was stirring in the depths of the earth, responding to the call of the mysterious widow's otherworldly incantations. Silas Blackwood, either braver or more foolish than his followers, stepped forward with a silver crucifix raised high and began shouting biblical verses at the top of his lungs in an attempt to counter whatever power Magdalena was invoking. The confrontation between ancient ritual and Christian prayer created a crackling tension in the air that made everyone's hair stand on end, while strange lights began to dance in the sky above them despite the absence of clouds or aurora conditions. Samuel watched in fascination and terror as the two opposing forces seemed to battle for dominance over the very fabric of reality itself. The standoff reached its climax when one of the more nervous mob members accidentally discharged his weapon, the sharp crack of the gunshot seeming to shatter whatever supernatural tension had been building in the air around them. In the moment of shocked silence that followed, Magdalena's ritual words ceased, and the unnatural phenomena that had been manifesting around the ranch property suddenly disappeared as if they had never existed at all. The temperature returned to normal winter levels, the shadows resumed their natural behavior, and the only sounds were the nervous breathing of the assembled crowd and the distant howling of coyotes across the prairie. Samuel realized in that moment that Magdalena had not been threatening the mob or demonstrating her power to harm them, but rather showing them a glimpse of the forces she normally kept carefully controlled and hidden from the world. Her otherworldly abilities were real and potentially dangerous, but she had spent decades learning to suppress and channel them in ways that allowed her to exist peacefully alongside ordinary humans. The display had been a warning rather than an attack, a demonstration that she possessed the power to defend herself and those she cared about if pushed beyond her considerable patience. The confrontation ended not with violence but with a grudging retreat as the townspeople slowly dispersed back to their homes, shaken by what they had witnessed but unwilling to escalate the situation further. Silas Blackwood lingered the longest, his zealous conviction clearly struggling against the evidence that whatever Magdalena represented was far more complex than the simple evil he had expected to confront. Samuel could see doubt creeping into the missionary's eyes as he processed the implications of what he had just experienced, the realization that his black and white worldview might be inadequate to address the shades of gray he had encountered. In the days that followed, Samuel and Magdalena found themselves effectively isolated from the community of Deadwood Gulch, though the hostility they faced was now tempered by a healthy respect for the mysterious widow's demonstrated capabilities. The practical result was that they were finally free to discuss their future without the constant interference of suspicious neighbors and religious zealots, though the weight of the decision Samuel needed to make had not diminished in the slightest. If anything, witnessing Magdalena's true nature firsthand had made the implications of their potential union even more profound and terrifying. As winter reached its harshest point, Samuel made his choice with the quiet determination that had carried him through decades of frontier hardship. He understood that accepting Magdalena's proposal would mean abandoning his simple rancher's existence in favor of something far more complex and dangerous. But he also recognized that turning away from this opportunity would mean spending the rest of his life wondering what might have been. On a crystalline morning when the snow sparkled like diamonds across the Wyoming landscape, he took Magdalena's impossibly large hand in his weathered one and spoke the words that would seal both their fates. The wedding ceremony, conducted by a traveling judge who asked no awkward questions about the bride's unusual stature or mysterious background, took place in Samuel's modest ranch house with only the wind across the prairie as witness to their vows. As they pledged their lives to each other, Samuel felt the strange sensation that he was participating in something far more significant than a simple marriage, as if his words were being recorded by forces beyond the material world. Magdalena's eyes never left his face during the brief ceremony, her expression carrying a mixture of joy, relief, and something that might have been profound gratitude for his willingness to share in her ancient purpose. The story concludes not with the immediate fulfillment of Magdalena's quest for a giant child, but with the quiet beginning of their life together as the winter slowly gave way to spring across the Wyoming territory. Samuel had learned that some mysteries are not meant to be solved quickly or easily, but rather lived with and experienced over the course of years or even decades. As he watched his extraordinary wife tend to their modest garden with hands that could crush stone but moved with surprising gentleness among the tender shoots, he understood that he had become part of something that stretched far beyond his individual existence, a story that would continue long after his own chapter had ended in the endless book of human evolution and possibility.